Patricia. I'm not going to use the microphone unless you can't hear me. Can you hear me back there? Is it okay? Okay, great. I have a pretty big voice. I'm a professor, so I end up trying to project all the time. But if my voice starts going down, just give me the signal and I'll ramp it up some. So to give you a bit of a background on the project, Western Washington University has an ongoing cooperative relationship with the National University of Mongolia. We have the second largest repository of Mongolian documents in the United States, second only to the Library of Congress, which is pretty incredible for a rather small research institution. And there was an interest in having some collaborative work between Western and the National University of Mongolia in a political science area. I teach political economy and I teach about globalization, and as I was talking about globalization recently in class, I thought, what about women in Mongolia? How have they been affected by globalization? So I started kind of developing this idea for a project about a year ago. I'm working with Dr. Undra, but she's not here today. But we are going to be collaborating on this project. So one of the things that I love to do when I teach about globalization, well, I move around a lot, so they have me boxed in. I can't move anywhere. That's okay. One of the things I love to do at the very start of my quarter on globalization is I have the students kind of list all the things they hate about it. And they are so filled with rage about globalization. It's kind of incredible. So I asked them to make this list about what they think globalization does or doesn't do. I asked them to define it. And then I asked them to think about if there are positive and negative effects of globalization. And we write it down. And then all term long, it's a pretty empirical course, all term long we systematically look at a series of things that they think globalization does. So we look at economic implications, we look at political implications. Does it undermine your democracy? Does it support your economic development? If it does support it, how does it support it? What are the measures? Does it make your inequality go up? Does it reduce female empowerment? Does it raise female empowerment? Does it undermine your environment? That's one people really like to talk about at Western, and I know they like to talk about it in Mongolia. If so, how exactly? And by the time we get to the end of the term, there is a collective, I like to describe it as catharsis, as students start to realize that many of the things that they thought globalization does, for better or worse, are not true. And so trying to disentangle what it actually means to say globalization and then to try to consider the effects of globalization are pretty formidable empirical questions. So my attempts today will lay out the research project and some preliminary findings about women and globalization in Mongolia. Before we start, I want to sort of define some of these terms. As you know, there is a lot of definitional disagreement over globalization. When my students first come to the class, they say things like, oh, globalization means westernization, right? Or globalization means neoliberal, colonial, anything bad that you want to attach to it. Just keep adding words that are really bad. And I say, okay, if we're going to empirically look at that, what does it even mean? So we start to look at processes involving interactions and integration between countries, nations, economies, cultures, and people. Right? So obviously there has to be some transnational element to it. And in particular, most people think globalization is driven largely by economic flows, but it's become way more than just economic. But we think about trade in goods and services, movement of money, investment, and capital flows across borders, technology transfers, the sharing of information and knowledge, and the movement of people, of humans across borders. And so if we think about this combination of goods, services, ideas, capital, information, and people, we start getting a sense of how we're going to empirically capture it. And then we can make sort of normative evaluations about it, whether or not those mechanisms look decidedly Western or if they look decidedly neoliberal or what have you, after we disentangle the definition from the measures. There are a lots of disagreements over the effects, both what kinds of things are positive and negative. In particular, I've kind of laid out some of the ones I have looked at in my studies and my class. Today, I want to turn some attention to the gendered effects of globalization. And that one has been less explored. Everyone really has focused on economic development. So in terms of gendered effects, there is obviously a big division or debate. The first set of literatures about the gendered effects of globalization highlighted an economic exploitation component for women in particular. So women are often described in this set of literatures as victims of globalization. Being the academic that I am, I've put some cites there, but that's just for you if you're interested in further reading. Why are they described as victims? Well, one, they have often found jobs in international, multinational corporations, often described as sweatshops, in textiles and light manufacturing. Here you kind of think about the emblematic problems with Nike or Adidas or textile and apparel industries in early development South Korea, where the state and multinationals work to politically, socially, and economically oppress women, literally locking them in factories at different points in time so that they couldn't leave during work hours. So there is this pejorative association between the kind of work like manufacturing, textiles and apparel that MNCs bring to developing countries. They like to employ women. They have often been described as more docile than men, having more nimble fingers for the kind of textile and apparel work that is, requires more attention to detail. Traditionally underemployed or unemployed, so huge pool of labor that had not been in the formal economy. So lots of reasons why they were engaged in those sectors. A second potential gendered effect of globalization involves the service industry, where you see increased women's migration for economic reasons. Philippine maids are a classic example in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Economically, these might be pretty secure jobs, but socially very culturally disconnected for these women. Their families rely on the money that they send home, and so those incomes become kind of lifebloods, causing women to be dependent, sort of tethered to their employers in, say, the Middle East or Southeast Asia. We've all heard the stories about maids being locked up, abused by their employers, denied their wages, having their passports withheld, etc., etc. So extremely negative effects. A third component of this discussion is focused on the race to the bottom, both in terms of environmental standards and labor standards. This could be especially felt by women. When we talk about a race to the bottom, there are two components of the race to the bottom. It could be that it's a race to the bottom in the developing country, in which the multinational corporations pulls down labor standards, environmental standards as they race towards rapid industrialization or growth. Or it could be that the race to the bottom is a global race to the bottom in which rich MNCs search out less expensive places to work because their environmental and labor standards are more lax, and therefore they're not monetized in the cost of production. So I just laid out all the reasons why we should hate MNCs, hate globalization and MNCs that are driving it. But there's actually a second component of the debate, and it's a component, it's an alter argument about women's empowerment in globalization. This one has gotten less attention from the academic community up until about 5 to 8 years ago, when we started getting more empirical evidence about how women have been affected through the processes of globalization that I described. A first set of findings has shown that more economic globalization in countries, so all the trade the investment flows, the inclusion of multinational corporations and foreign direct investment, all of that is associated with more female economic empowerment. And what do I mean by that? Well, by economic empowerment, we have a mixture of things, either higher wages and or paid work outside the home, so a movement from informal to formal economy, or a movement from unpaid domestic labor to paid labor in the informal or formal economy. Educational opportunities and increased literacy in those countries that have had more economic globalization. MNCs actually like to chase rule of law and highly educated workforces. They're less likely to chase cheap wages than you think. 80% of multinational corporation foreign direct investment goes between rich countries. 80%. If I'm conservative, it will be 75%, right? So that means only 25% of MNC foreign direct investment is going towards developing countries. So where they're bringing that foreign direct investment, they're kind of trying to look for these educational opportunities and rule of law environments. What else do we see? We see improvements in life expectancy and maternal mortality. We see work outside traditional rural sectors as an engine for social change. There's been a lot of literature about this in the case of China. Maybe you've seen some of this. Maybe some of you know the book Factory Girls that got quite a bit of attention. Is anyone familiar with that? It's sort of a tracing of the narratives of women who lived in rural China as they moved to urban centers to work in sweatshops. And those opportunities are documented over the course of a series of years of oral histories. And the girls in these positions describe a feeling of social empowerment that is not possible when they live with their families in rural environments. That they earn money, that they can pick their own boyfriend, that they have opportunities to choose their dress or go out in the evening, that they have opportunities to take additional education classes. So there is, consistent with modernization theory, an element of this engine of change associated with urbanization, industrialization, and education that expands the economic and social and political opportunities of women as they move into from rural to urban sectors. In particular, Gray, Kittleson, and Sandholz, 2006, I took out the slide where I looked at it, but they looked at 180 countries from 1975 to 2000. And what they did was try to control in a large quantitative analysis for the effects of economic globalization on a series of measures of female empowerment. This time period is the time period that included the pernicious multinational corporations. It's also the time period where we started to see the rise of development centers outside of traditional Europe or the Americas. And what they saw was significant and consistent economic, social, and political empowerment of women in countries that had more globalization. However, they didn't have Mongolia. They didn't have Mongolian in their inquiry, or some, but 180 countries. It's a significant sample. So it's across a range of developing countries, looking at 25 years of development. So it kind of got me thinking. In terms of our way of thinking about globalization, it's not just economic globalization. It's also the diffusion of social, political, and cultural norms, gender norms, shifting ideas about women in the workplace, or balance between work and home, or shifting ideas about family size, or delayed marriage, or educational opportunities. And so one of the interesting ways, one of the interesting things that Gray and all did was to disaggregate globalization into those three different components. And so for my project, I'm also trying to disaggregate globalization. So we start to think not just about globalization as this monolith, but instead about the transmission belts of change that are possible, maybe even competing between economic, political, and social globalization networks. So to give you then a sense of where I'm going with this, my question How has globalization affected women in Mongolia, is designed to look at a couple of these different aspects, right? About economic opportunities, about political, cultural opportunities or changes, asking questions in particular about this post-transition period. My political economy background is post-communist, post-Soviet stuff. Right? So one of the things that really intrigued me about Mongolia is that I have had a lot of experience working in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And I was trying to figure out what's similar and what's different about the Mongolian transition experience from centrally planned economics and socialist style thinking about gender and women. So in terms of my research design, I've got 4 parts. The first part I'm going to kind of lay out for us today some comparative data analysis with some preliminary quantitative stuff. My battery is running low. Close. It says my PC battery is running low. Now that wasn't a comment about me. I am a little jet lagged, but I'm still okay. So the first is a set of comparative quantitative data where I'm going to situate Mongolia within the post-Soviet experience and the developing country experience. The second is a series of surveys that we have up and running. So we have a set of surveys about attitudes towards globalization in Mongolia. The UB component is web-based. The rule component is face-to-face. The students are conducting the face-to-face surveys. This weekend, there should be about 150 of them, and right now there are 210 web-based ones. So it's a pretty good sample size about attitudes. There's some focus groups that are planned that haven't happened yet. Those are next week, and ongoing interviews with women in different economic, political, and social sectors. And one of the things I'm really interested in is trying to discern if the attitudes about globalization actually comport with some of the data that we're going to look at about preliminary findings. So before I go too much further in showing you some facts and figures, I want to tell you what globalization means. So I got the 3 different components: economic, political, and social. There are big measures of globalization. I'm going to use the KOF index of globalization because it's publicly available. It has a huge time frame, a lot of countries. It tries to not have the same normative components of it as the foreign policy globalization index, but there are a lot of them out there. So it looks at trade, investment, capital flows, as well as restrictions on trade and capital. So the extent to which you have trade protection in place. It looks at different components of political globalization, because the idea here is that the more you are politically engaged, maybe you are engaged in U.S. peacekeeping operations, maybe you're engaged in a variety of international organizations, maybe you have foreign embassies, so you have opportunities like this for exchanges of ideas, right? It's the iteration, the iterated interactions with others in global spheres on multifaceted issue areas that is allegedly the transmission belt of changes in political ideas. Social globalization, I think that one's really hard to capture, but they're trying to look at cross-border personal contact communication flows. These are some examples, cultural proximity measures. And I actually have the data about it, but I didn't want to put it up here because it almost makes your eyes bleed. There are maybe 25 measures that they try to combine and weight to capture different aspects of globalization. All right, so what about women's empowerment? What does that even look like? So I'm looking at a number of ways to think about women's empowerment. I'm using a couple different ways because they don't all capture the same idea, and my goal is to triangulate some of these issues. So the first one I put up here is the Gender Development Index from the UNDP. And this one tries to compare gaps in health, knowledge, and living standards between men and women. So it's an approximation of the Human Development Index. Maybe some of you have looked at it. It includes things like levels of secondary education, maternal mortality rates, labor force participation, adolescent birth rates, the share of women's seats in parliament, right? So it's trying to compare some components that are economic, some that are political, some that are social, and the ratio of male to female attainment of those development indicators. The Gender Inequality Index is another UNDP measure that's also trying to get at this male-female ratio, so a comparison. So not just how many years of education does a female have, but how does that compare to male, the male population, and how does that compare in terms of economic opportunities, right? So it's trying to go the next step rather than look at the absolute figures, the relative, the ratios between men and women in the countries. So the gender inequalities has these, has health measures. Reproductive health is especially important for women in this one. Political representation, educational achievement, and economic status. I pull out some of the constitutive measures and look at some of them individually so that we can get rid of some of the noise that might happen if you have a large composite index. So women's labor force participation, female gross national income per capita, so how much money do women make? Right? What's their typical salary? The percentage of seats held by women in parliament, and it's a World Bank figure that tends to be the proxy for women's political engagement. I'm not particularly thrilled about that one, but that one is the standard that's used in the literature, so I'm engaging with it just to see what it looks like in the case of Mongolia. Years of schooling and educational attainment, and adolescent fertility rates and maternal mortality rates. So these are just some of the figures. So I'm going to present to you some comparative descriptive statistics to examine the Mongolian experience with respect to some countries in the region. So first, this is what globalization looks like in Mongolia, right? It's no surprise it's going up over time. This period here, am I allowed to move? Okay, it's too late. So this period here, this is 1991, because the numbers are really small here, and then you can sort of see the total globalization is not the highest one. The highest one is political globalization, and the total globalization is actually pulled down by the level of economic globalization, which is behind the other measures. So it's going up, it's trending up, but it's not trending up equally. And as you can see, this interesting one, economic globalization, trails the others, and also has bottomed out at times and gone down. Why would it go down? If trade goes down, if trade protection goes down, if economic nationalism rises and you see less foreign direct investment with respect to heavy industries. So all of those could be reasons why you might see that go down. But this kind of just gives you a visual of what it looks like. Okay, so this is a post-Soviet comparison. What does that look like? So why did I choose these countries? Well, I often hear people talk to me about what would be a good comparison set for Mongolia, right? So I wanted to get some countries that were proximate. I wanted to get some countries that might share some historical or social components like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. I pulled out Georgia just because that's a post-Soviet experience that's not as resource dependent, but it's a resource transit country. And so it has similar resource development issues like Mongolia. Okay, so what do we see here? Mongolia is this star. So it started out here before the independence at the bottom, right? And it's significantly increased, but as you can see, Mongolia has lagged behind. It's at the bottom of the other countries in the region. And now it's sort of in the middle. It's kind of clustered around the other post-Soviet experiences, right? Things have sort of leveled off. But if we're kind of thinking about it in regional perspective, it doesn't look. It started quite behind, it's lagged behind others, and some of this is pulled down by its economic, slowdown of economic globalization. All right, so what else do I have? This is, okay, I'll stop moving on. No, okay. So if you look at these, so these are, this is the economic globalization, and then that's the total globalization on top, right? So this looks, you can see economic the economic globalization has sort of trailed off, while the total one has remained quite high. Now, what is the lines? The lines are the GNI, gross national income per capita. That includes men and women. It's not the male one, right? And this is the female gross national income per capita. So you can see how significantly behind the female GNI per capita is to the total. All right, so why did I put this up here? One reason I put it up here is you see this female GNI per capita is leveled off and going down. So one of the things we wouldn't expect is for female earnings to be going down, to be leveling off and going down. And we've seen a plateauing of total. Right? But as I'm going to show you in a little while, the earnings ratio as well as the gender wage gap has been going up. So between 1996 and 2015, the gender wage gap between men and women went from 4.8% to 12.6% in Mongolia, right? A fourfold increase, gender wage gap. So that means the women are earning more, but the wage gap between them and their male counterparts is significantly increasing. So one of the things to really think about. So let's look some more at some comparative numbers. Female population with at least some secondary education. Everyone I talk to highlights how well educated Mongolians are, which it has been really extraordinary to see the gender disparity in education. Women have this gender education gap almost, right, where they're outpacing their male counterparts in secondary and tertiary education. The gender gap really takes off at the secondary level. But if we take a look at the female population with at least some secondary education compared to the other countries in the region, it's kind of surprising, I think. Right? I think I was not expecting to see this. Right? I was not expecting to see Mongolia behind these other countries in the region, behind Uzbekistan. Right? So this was a little, the reason Uzbekistan doesn't have data listed here is that there was no publicly available data. So I put up whatever was publicly available. So this one was just really puzzling to me as I kind of took a look at we know that there has been a significant shift in, I'm going to get out of this one because this one is related. This is the mean years of schooling. Okay? So this is directly related to the female population. So as you can see in terms of the mean years of schooling, Mongolia lags behind the other regional counterparts as well. So I was kind of trying to think some about the gender wage gap, the education. We know that there have been significant shifts, and we can come back to some of these, but there have been significant shifts in secondary school enrollment across the region after 1991, and during and right after the period of herd privatization. We saw a huge dip in enrollment as we saw more children kept out of school to help with with herding. But the graph here I thought was actually pretty alarming. Mongolia is the red one with the dots, right? So it's the one at the bottom there compared to the other countries in the region. When I speak with everyone, they tell me about the 98% literacy rate, but the latest numbers were 87%, which is significantly down from the 98% originally. The higher dropout rates are often associated with herder families as they needed more manpower with larger herd size to maintain these economies of scale. So even though, and I'm going to go back to women here, so this one is just an illustration of what Mongolia looks like compared to other regional counterparts. When we look at women and years of schooling, it's still an incredible level of tertiary education in Mongolia. However, two-thirds of university graduates are female, which is an extraordinary amount. But there's a significant gender selection in the majors that we see, with men choosing engineering and architecture, and women clustering in personal or cultural services, humanities and social sciences. They have about equal matriculation in terms of math. These have significant wage implications, right? The kinds of majors, so it's not just the total level of education you have, it's also what you major in. And interestingly enough, we see these trends in the States as well, where women select out of STEM fields. Right? And the STEM fields often pay more than being an English major, a political scientist for that matter. So it's not translating necessarily into the female GNI, gross national income, the income that women make. So in terms of Mongolian regional perspective, we've been looking at just some comparative charts that are kind of thinking about what Mongolia looks like. In terms of Mongolia's level of globalization, they have been rising, but they trail other similar post-Soviet regional cases. There is unequal engagement across the different kinds of globalization, with more social and political globalization than economic globalization. But since economic globalization is the engine of most changes for women, being behind or dropping or stagnant in terms of your level of economic engagement, we're thinking here about trade, development, investment, has significant gendered implications. Both the percentage of the female population with a secondary education and the number of years of schooling of women in Mongolia, this is grammatically correct, are below regional comparisons. Since education is one of the drivers of female empowerment, this obviously has gendered implications as well for labor force participation. In particular, we've seen post-secondary enrollments dropping significantly after the transition in both relative and absolute terms for men and women. So one of the questions that I had after looking at some of the comparative work was, okay, well, what does that look like in terms of Mongolia-only experiences? So I put together, I think I'm going to delete it in this side, I put together a large quantitative regression analysis. It's very preliminary, and I didn't put up the regression results because this didn't seem like the kind of crowd that wanted a table with R-squared values. But that's okay. So I'll just kind of summarize what it's looking like right now. So one of the, maybe you kind of guessed it already, but I do a lot with resource rents and development in resource-rich countries, because they have lots of what we call rentier state dynamics. This means that if you have an economy, think Saudi Arabia, right? You got a lot of oil, but it doesn't require a lot of labor, right? It's mostly capital intensive. It usually happens outside city centers. It doesn't generate many jobs. It generates extraordinary rents, and it tends to squeeze out other economic opportunities, right? So you don't have light manufacturing. You don't have small SMEs. You have the state with significant social welfare outlays for citizens. Some in the rentier state literature, we call it side payments, right? Because it kind of looks like the state is buying your acquiescence for all of these social welfare benefits that you have. And maybe that's politically stable, but if you have a state that is driven by that kind of narrow industrial development, it crowds out the small and medium enterprise opportunities for decentralized economic decision making. It crowds out all those sweatshops that people love to hate, that give women jobs outside the home when they don't have technical skills or higher levels of higher technical skills or educational capacity. Mongolia is obviously not that, and we have a lot of education here, but the technical skills are lacking. And so when I looked at the regression analyses, I'm trying to look at Mongolia compared to other states that are also resource rich. You and I know that Mongolia's GDP is 1/3 from industrial mining and extraction, right? That's really significant. Another third is from agriculture, or thereabouts. So that leaves about a third-ish, a little less than that, for the other aspects, mostly service sectors at this point. But if a third of your economy is this kind of extractive industry, this industrial development, what does that do for women? Well, we know in the Middle East and in resource-rich states, not just the Middle East, because of course there's a cultural component, but resource-rich states, is that women tend to be crowded out of those other formal sector economic jobs. So trying to control for some of that, looking at Mongolia in comparison, trying to control for its overall level of development, trying to control for its level of democracy, and what I'm starting to see is that even controlling for all those components, that more globalization is associated with higher levels of female income, higher levels of development for women, and lower levels of gender inequality. So so part of the comparison of Mongolia that I'm just going to show you are just some simple scatter plots, no scary regression analyses or anything like that look at some relationships over time so we can kind of get a sense. And as you see, I tried to highlight some of the time periods. The female gross national income per capita isn't available for all the periods between 1995 and 2000, between 2000 and 2005. It's available on a 5-year scale over those, so that's why you don't have a whole clustering of dots right there. But you can see that as economic globalization levels are higher, we tend to see a higher level of female income in Mongolia over this time period. This is not controlling for all of those regression analyses that I talked about, and it's lagged. And the reason it's lagged is because you expect that you would have globalization in, say, time period 1, and then it will take a while for it to affect female employment. So there's no wizardry going on here. It's just trying to figure out if there's some kind of sequential relationship. So in terms of that female GNI per capita, that's pretty, in PPP terms, purchasing power parity terms, so that keeps it equal in terms of what they can purchase. So it's not how much money they earn, but how much purchasing power that money had in each of the years. This is a relationship between economic globalization and women's labor force participation, which we already know lags that of men, and I've told you that it has, the labor force participation gap has increased from 4.8% to 12.6%. So this one, we also see a positive relationship, but it's more muted, right? The slope of this line, as you can see, there's an R squared here, is 0.30. The other one was 7. So this one is definitely a more muted relationship. So we see more economic globalization. It's got a positive, but a muted relationship with women's labor force participation. So that's the puzzle, really, right? That's part of the puzzle about why is it that women's labor force participation rates are going down over this time period. This is the Gender Development Index from the UNDP, and as a reminder, that Gender Development Index is the comparison of the Human Development Index that captures education, mortality, labor force participation, adolescent birth rates, share of seats in parliament, so education, living standards, and health, and the level of globalization. So this is the total level of globalization, so that factors in the fact that the economic is pulling it down, but political and social might be pulling it up. And this one is a pretty strong positive relationship. As the level of globalization has gone up, gender development in Mongolia has gone up as well, right? This one is an inverse relationship between social globalization and gender inequality. So as social globalization goes up, gender inequality goes down. Right, so the gender inequality is the UNDP. I'm not trying to trick you by showing one's going positive and one's going negative. When we think about inequality, we tend to think about it going down, right? So visually, that's why I presented. You can see the numbers with 2017 being the most recent one. And this one has got the strongest correlation at 0.82, which is pretty strong. The social globalization, these mechanisms of social change, changing norms, changing values, that is what social globalization is trying to capture, albeit imperfectly. So the point of, oh, I did put my data regression, but I've already told you what it was. So in terms of initial findings, more economic globalization is associated with more women's labor force participation and higher incomes. The weaker relationship for labor force participation than for earnings is partially a function of the lower levels of economic globalization in Mongolia than other countries in the region, and is also partially a function of the fact that so many women are employed in the informal sector in Mongolia, right? So they get undercounted, both in terms of their income and in terms of their labor force participation, but it remains an area for further research. But contrary to the initial, we're having the debate between the two literatures. Is it generally bad? Is it generally good? Is it conditional? Is it somewhere in between? It's definitely conditional, but we see strong positive associations between economic globalization and women's economic empowerment. More overall globalization is associated with significant improvements in gender development, both in terms of a long and healthy life, knowledge, and in GNI measures. And finally, more social globalization is associated with decreasing gender inequality, and these are some of the measures of it, just so you can visualize it rather than just hear me talk about it. So these initial findings, to go back to my disaggregated discussion of globalization, I'm trying to pull out some of the different components of it, right? Try to riddle, maybe politicals acting in one way, and social globalization, which is very high compared to economic, is having a force in another way. Do we see them working in the same direction or competing directions? And how are they together and separately affecting aspects of women's empowerment in Mongolia? So the quantitative analysis, the regression analysis, includes a bunch of these, but is able to control for stuff. You can't control for much in a scatter plot, right? So if I put up a scatter plot, as a political scientist, we're trained to be piranhas, right? The first thing that you say is, what about this? What about that? Did you think about this? So you can't do that in these visual scatter plots. But in a regression analysis, you can start controlling for some of them, like resource rents, or the level of democracy in a country, for example. All right, so that's the first part of the project. The second part of this project is the survey work. So I'm going to present just some of the preliminary findings that don't include the rural sector, because as I told you, those are going to happen this weekend. So one of the goals of the survey was to better understand people's perceptions about globalization and Mongolia, and specifically about the potential gendered effects of globalization on Mongolia. I wanted to do a survey because when I talk to my students about globalization, their perception of what is happening is often very different from the measures of what is actually happening. And when they're presented with the findings, there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance. Right? They struggle to reconcile their strong emotional feelings about change, whatever that change is, often cultural, but it could be economic change. And so I wanted to kind of consider popular attitudes about globalization to see if it did or didn't comport with the empirical findings about globalization. So we have some questions about if economic globalization has helped women, people's perceptions of it, if globalization has affected women's empowerment and attitudes about equality, if globalization has undermined traditional culture and practices, and if globalization has changed ideas about governance in a political sense. So try to capture economic, political, and social components without being too laborious, because I don't know about you, but anytime someone asks me to take a survey, I generally say no, And I don't want to do that. So we had a kind of a small 10-question survey. It was, on average, people took about 2.5 minutes to complete it. That way it was not particularly onerous to get buy-in. Okay. And I should say that of the 210 individuals that started taking the survey, 209 finished it and completed it. So there's a very high response rate, which is remarkable, and I'm very appreciative about that. So in terms of the responses, I have strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, and strongly disagree. So the traditional survey responses, the top is agree, the bottom is disagree. So this question is about, asked, globalization has created, so they could agree or disagree with these statements. Globalization has created new jobs and economic opportunities for workers in Mongolia without specifying gender. And you can see that the blue is the agree, and the green is the strongly. So pretty significant popular belief that it has created economic opportunities in Mongolia. I have a hunch, I don't know, but I have a hunch this might look different from the rural surveys, and I'm really excited to look at that to see how your economic trajectory or the different demographics, the different education levels might affect these notions. Globalization has affected Mongolian attitudes about gender equality, encouraging more women's economic rights. We still see a significant number agreeing with this, but we see the yellow in the middle as more people, not so sure, neither agree nor disagree. But in general, fairly positive. Culture and globalization, this one is of course more contentious. Globalization has undermined traditional cultural norms and practices in Mongolia. And what I see here is just a lot of uncertainty, right? So you see people agreeing with this statement, right? That's the blue and the green. People not so sure, and then people disagreeing, and then people disagreeing vehemently, which we haven't had a lot of the disagreeing vehemently in the other ones. So when I looked at this, my initial thoughts were that this kind of uncertainty about the cultural impact of economic globalization, people think it's pretty positive. But maybe the cultural trade-offs feel uncomfortable, inappropriate even. So the survey responses reflected, even in a fairly educated pool of respondents, this kind of uncertainty about the cultural impact. And if I had to wager a guess, I would imagine that some of this would look decidedly negative in the rural sectors, but I don't know. I guess we will find out soon. Information flows associated with globalization have changed my perceptions of the quality of government in Mongolia. So it's trying to get at some of the political effects. In particular, kind of thinking some about what individuals see in other countries, or what they can expect of their government, right? Just hearing about, say, global LGBTQ movements, or hearing about the women's empowerment movements around the world, or hearing about protests if your government is corrupt. These sorts of things might change the way you think about your own government and your potential approach to civic activism. As you can see, the blue is really quite strong here. Strong agree. That plus the green equal about 70%. So about 70% said information flows associated with globalization have changed my perceptions. The yellow is about 22% unsure. So in terms of these preliminary respondents, we see about 80% said globalization has created new jobs. There was one question about whether or not globalization has helped urban workers with more education and technical skills, but failed to help rural workers with less education. And there's also that conditional response. We say about 50% said the effects are conditional, which fits with kind of this mixed understanding of who gains and who loses from globalization and those voices. In terms of political attitudes, about 72% said globalization has affected Mongolian attitudes about gender equality, encouraging more women's economic rights. So these are just some of the preliminary findings we had with the survey. The positive attitudes regarding economic globalization with a recognition of differential impact on rural or less educated population. A belief that economic globalization has supported women's empowerment. A belief that more global information flows affect national political attitudes. We didn't ask if they were positive effects or negative effects. We just asked if they affected. And honestly, we didn't want to get into that kind of loaded normative question. And then uncertainty about cultural changes. The wording of the questions were exactly the wording I showed you. So trying not to ask questions, is it negative or is it positive? Just are they changing? A follow-up survey could ask, do you think it's negative or do you think it's positive? But we were trying to look at globalization's way of changing your behaviors or attitudes around economic, political, and social factors. The second phase survey, as I mentioned, is going to be drawn from a very different sample. I'm really hopeful about that. Next week, we also have focus groups, gender-based, to better understand attitudes about the relationship between globalization and women's empowerment. There's an age from 18 to 60. We have 90-minute focus groups, men and women, mixture of educational levels, asking some of these more poignant questions so that we can get more elaborate responses that might hint at whether or not they think these changes are positive and negative and what the causal mechanisms are for these changes. So that's the next phase of the research project. So in my conclusion, much left to do, so I really welcome your feedback. The preliminary evidence is pretty positive. It leans in the direction of supporting the second camp with the caveat that the levels of globalization in Mongolia, while they're below those of other countries in the region, could affect the impact it has on women's empowerment in Mongolia. I think if you recall the chart on globalization, things have leveled off. Right? There's not more intensification. I did not put up countries that are highly globalized, because then Mongolia would be way at the bottom, and then you'd have Denmark and Singapore up on top, right? So I put their regional counterparts. So there's a lot of potential for it to shift into more economic globalization, and not just economic globalization as in trading more from industrial minds, but a diversified, complex economy, which is where you get the empowerment of different demographic groups, including but not limited to women. So we see preliminary support for that argument, but the support could be conditional and uneven, hence the use of the rural surveys and the quantitative analysis. So we can also take a look at how the demographics, we have demographics on the participants in the survey, so their level of education, their gender, their age, so we can try to get a sense of if these ideas, these beliefs about globalization have a significant demographic slant to them. And one of the things that I'm really trying to gain more understanding of are these shifts in attitudes and norms about female empowerment and equality considered positive for the general population. So thank you very much for your time.